Bien, bonjour à tous. J'ai le plaisir d'accueillir Monsieur Xavier Espot-Samora, qui est le chef du gouvernement de la République d'Andorre.
Bienvenue, Monsieur le Premier ministre.
Nous sommes ici dans ce cadre général de la coopération dans la rivalité, ce qui, je trouve, est un excellent thème parce qu'il ne s'agit pas de nier les rivalités, elles existent, mais il s'agit de trouver le cadre de la coopération dans cette rivalité. Et bien sûr, le défi du changement climatique est essentiel et c'est peut-être l'un des secteurs dans lesquels on peut continuer à trouver le chemin de la coopération parce que, effectivement, on voit qu'il y a au moins un accord minimal, y compris entre pays très concurrents, between competing countries, between rival countries, but we can at least agree that this is the greatest challenge facing the human race, and it's a threat for security. And we can't see the human race surviving to extreme climate change. Now, Prime Minister, your country is a small one, and I'm sure you have ideas on how you can combat climate change, but it can be, of course, impacted. Andorra is a magnificent country, and I'm sure you want to preserve your landscape, and your economy is dependent on tourism, and you want to maintain the attraction for tourism. And how can you have economic considerations without having too much impact from climate changes in the wonderful Principality of Andorra? Thank you very much, Pascal Boniface. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be here to have a discussion with you on cooperation and rivalry and looking at this major challenge which we're all concerned about, which is to deal with climate change. First, we have to see what the United Nations Secretary General said at the last General Assembly in September. He called on countries to take action, to take decisive and immediate urgent action. He didn't talk about global warming, but global boiling. And of course, climate change is here. It is substantial, and obviously all countries have to respond regardless of their contribution to climate change. Now, Andorra is a landlocked country in the Pyrenees. It's a very small country, around 400 square meters, 83,000 people, and it's 0.0001 of global greenhouse gas emissions. And so people might think that the actions taken by my country have no impact on climate change on a global scale. However, this is not the approach of my government or of the citizens of Andorra. It is a global challenge, but we must take on our individual responsibilities. And we are firmly convinced that action, even from very small countries with only minimal impact on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, can still stand as an example and can share their experience and best practices around the world. And of course, as you said, while we do not produce a great deal of pollution, there is the impact of climate change on our country, on the land, and on the economy of the country, and this is a huge impact. Sometimes when we think about climate change, we might, for example, think about the islands in the Pacific Ocean, which suffer greatly from climate change. But we mustn't forget that mountain ecosystems, that areas that are at high altitude, as is the case of Andorra, are going to have severe effects from climate change. And Of course, we have made our mountain ecosystem a major part of our economy, and 40% of our GDP, directly or indirectly, is related to tourism and tourist activities. There are ski resorts. We have the largest ski resorts in this part of Europe, and every year there's less and less snow because of climate change, and each time it goes down, it has a substantial impact and will have an even greater impact on the future of our economy. So what are your plans? What measures have you taken to mitigate the impact and maintain the level of tourism? What have you done, for example, about snow cover? As you say, you're in high altitude. And what can you do? Because for many years, tourism didn't really focus on the impact of climate change. So what have you done to mitigate the impact? What have you done to deal with the impact on tourism and questions of pollution and waste management? Well, of course, we were aware of this situation and we wanted to set a good example here. And of course, our contribution is going to have a good effect for our economy, and we're going to continue to work substantially to combat climate change, and not just at an international level, but also in national action. There's a key point, and unfortunately we see this everywhere, and that is that we do have consensus from parliaments having to take action on climate change. In 2017, there was the energy transition legislation. That was an ambitious law voted by our parliament, and it was a unanimous vote to have this law. And this was a very clear statement, and we had the legal framework needed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to follow the Paris climate agreements and to get the country as carbon neutral by 2050. Of course, we know it's now the statement that's been made for the climate emergency. We did this. We drew it up with support from the younger generation because they're mainly concerned by this, they're greatly concerned by this, and once again it was a unanimous vote in favor of that official statement. And we have introduced an environmental tax. There's a €30 carbon charge per tonne. And we have set up a green fund which is designed to ensure proper, efficient energy transition so that we can have a better effect on the environment from the main contributors of the Green Fund. And the Green Fund is for sustainable development. And last year we set up free public transport. We're one of the few countries in the world where all public transport is free for all users. And that's an important point, and it's had a major effect on the climate. And we've also seen that it's been very good for low-income households. We were also involved in ambitious funding for aid programs for energy efficiency, providing renewable energy sources in buildings and electric vehicles. And in Andorra, there's no heavy industry, so the activities that really have an impact on climate change are transport, basically, and heating, and heating in buildings. And so the Green Fund was used to set up programs to focus on those concrete issues. They're just examples. So what solutions did you implement to reduce carbon emissions so far as possible? You said, okay, the main sources of carbon emissions were transport and heating. There's general business, of course, but what can be done to really reduce carbon emissions as much as possible? Well, we've mentioned the free public transport program. That was a highly ambitious program. There's also the ambitious program for energy efficiency in buildings, and we're trying to change our economy so that we're less dependent on tourism. And well, that's a shame. That would be a shame if you can't have all the tourists who would love to go to Andorra. Well, of course, but we want to have all the best biodiversity in the mountain area, and we want to have less negative impact on the ecosystem. So we can't have 10 million tourists a year. I don't know if you realize that you've got 80,000 people and 400 square meters. And we've got these 10 million tourists a year, and this has an impact on transport and ecosystems and biodiversity. And of course, that even in summer, there are still tourists who come to Andorra to enjoy the mountain setting and landscape. And so we'd like to reduce the number of tourists so that we have quality tourism. Are you going to set quotas? Well, we won't have quotas, but we've introduced a tourist tax. And that's so that we can get the tourism away from the resorts so that all the tourists don't turn up at the same time of the year. And so that's a more selective approach. We don't have quotas, but we're trying to diversify the economy so that we're less dependent on tourism. And this is part of the flagship project which we have to negotiate an association with the European Union, and we're reaching the final stages of that agreement. And this is a very ambitious agreement, one of the most which has been offered to a third country, and we're going to be able to gradually move into the European market in a structured way, and we'll be able to set up high value-added business sectors with less impact on the environment. For example, small industry with high value-added research, for example, research into biomedicine, and all these areas of research which are not currently developed in Andorra employ qualified people. It's high value added, and there's less impact on the land and on biodiversity. Are there discussions in your country? You said there was an agreement between the different political parties. You said there's general agreement, but are the citizens willing to follow you and make the efforts needed so that the initiatives taken by the government are taken on board by citizens? Sometimes you have to make efforts so that you get the citizens at the bottom agreeing with the decisions at the top. Of course, and I think actions implemented nationally and internationally to deal with climate change and legislation and statements made on climate urgency and so on, we could say that there is widespread support. You could almost say it's unanimous support from both politicians and citizens. But we have this process which is key to our economy, and the European Union process is subject for debate. And of course, we have citizens who find it hard to imagine this new economic model, which is quite different from what we've had in the past, and which was a source of great wealth for our country. Well, your GDP per citizen is one of the highest. Yes, we're up to about $40,000 per head of population. We're a rich country, and 40% of our economy depends on one single sector. And because of climate change, is up against major challenges, which means that we're in a vulnerable position, and that's why we've been working on this great challenge of diversifying our economy and have been doing saying that since 2015 we want to open up our economy with approval for international transparency and our involvement on the EU market, which would be an opportunity for us to be more competitive and have technical recognition of the laws and regulations of the European Union, so that companies could set up business in Andorra in specific sectors which have to be identified and specified as value-added areas in Andorra. So what participation do you have in overall efforts and involvement in different forums? Because you've got your model for change, they're going from economic dependency, which could have a high environmental cost, and so it's quite brave to be able to look at the future and change in relation to a successful model. So you have a message perhaps for other countries here at the forum. Will you go to COP28? Yes, of course we will. So what messages will you have in COP28? Well, of course, we'll be there at COP28. As I said, as a small country, we believe that our role is to set a good example. And if we do things properly and show that we can do things efficiently, then other countries will see that that it can be done, and they will have an even greater impact on climate change. So we were one of the first signatories of the Paris Agreement, and we are committed to complying with the obligations, and of course we work in line with the Framework Convention of the United Nations, and we're working on the objectives, and we're one of the first countries to have submitted the first two-yearly report on transparency. We're one of the first countries to do that in line with the requirement of the Paris Agreement, and the work was done at a national level, and we've seen what our 2030 ambitions are for greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, and that was made even stricter after Glasgow. And we've upgraded our ambitions. It was originally 37% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions for 2030, and now we've gone up to 55% for 2030, and we've really taken that challenge on board, and we are convinced that we will be able to meet that goal. And you talked about the next COP, and we're looking at the possibility of having a vulnerability of mountain ecosystems being registered as an issue, and we're working in a multilateral way in coordination with other countries. What countries? Well, other European countries such as Switzerland and Italy, but not just European countries. There's also Nepal. There are developed countries and developing countries that have the same mountain ecosystems and have the same problem of vulnerability to climate change. And so we're working on that, because for the next COP we want to have the specific conditions of mountain climate conditions involved in the work there. What's your energy mix? Well, we're highly dependent on outside energy sources. 80% of our energy is imported. And we're talking about fossil fuels mostly. And there again, we have an ambitious plan. Not only do we want to have greater energy sovereignty, but we want to improve the mix, and we want to do that with non-polluting sectors. So we're setting up a wind farm in Andorra, and that will produce 10% of the power consumption. You're talking about overall energy or just electricity? Overall, it's huge. And solar energy, yes, we're certainly working on solar energy, and we're extending the solar farms too. And we've got high sun levels in the mountains coming from the Mediterranean, and we're working in public with public authorities and also with the private sector. And I think we have to see that the energy transition can't be done just by itself. We have a role, obviously, to run things and set the example in the public sector, but we have to do it in cooperation with the private sector. So we're working on that. We're working on new regulations which will make it much easier for the private sector to work on such projects. And since for some time now, we have a small section for hydroelectricity, and we're working on cross-border projects with France so that we can have a win-win solution for France and Andorra and increase hydroelectricity and also green energy. You talked about housing and heating. Now, a large part of the buildings with residential facilities for people who are permanent residents or for tourists, a lot of that was built when energy was cheap, and there were virtually no considerations given to climate. Do you have plans to upgrade these buildings? Now, we have the implementation of the legislation on energy and climate change, and we've had some major steps forward there. But for some countries, if you compare to other countries, it might not seem important, but we've spent more than 2 million euros. It's an overall budget of 400 million euros. And we earmarked that just for energy in housing. It's a huge percentage. It is indeed a huge percentage. And a lot of buildings have done the energy upgrade. As you said, they were built in the 60s, 70s and 80s at a time where we didn't think of such energy challenges. And we think that a lot of our housing has already been upgraded. And we have very low or even zero impact. And to conclude, before we give the floor to the audience for questions, when you look at the challenges that you have and the future of your country, are you optimistic? You certainly seem to be very proactive and positive, and do you think that you can face the future without being over-anxious, as some people are when they talk about the environment?
Are you speaking generally or in Andorra in particular? Well, I mean both. How will Andorra endure this, and how do you feel, generally speaking, about it? Well, on some days we are being pessimistic and on other optimistic. But when one listens to global leaders, the leadership of the French president, but also leaders from developing countries, I think that there is an increasing will to implement solutions, ambitious solutions, to fight against climate change. The Prime Minister of Barbados said it a few minutes ago. I think we will succeed in saving our planet. Now we are just wondering at what cost will this come, and if we don't want to pay too high a tribute, I think we need to work faster, we need to act faster. When it comes to Andorra, with all the humility I should display as a very small country, if we're able to show that with limited resources and being very much impacted by climate change, we can manage to face the challenges that are in the Paris Agreement, the challenges that are identified at every COP. I think that very polluting countries will be able to have a greater impact on the changes that are needed. In the starting session, we can see that very different countries, one is in the Caribbean, another one is in a mountain setting, and they share some challenges, and it is of the utmost urgency that they are able to face climate change and to mitigate it. Well, actually, I agree that we have more common points than differences. We've decided that public transportation would become free for all. This is a very costly project that costs 7 to 8 million a year, which is huge for a country like ours. This amounts to 1% of our general budget. But I think that ambition and courage are needed here. And this should not be seen as a cost, but an investment. Our country, pollution in our country is decreasing. Our families, households that are economically vulnerable in the face of inflation are able to save 30 to 60 to even 100 euros a month, which is a lot of money. That helps in paying rent, for example, being able to go out as well. And in doing this, we've improved the quality of life in our country. As I said, we have a very small country, and only 2% of its surface has population living on there. And we knew that the situation of transportation was really not good, and we knew that it meant a low quality of life. So we know that in doing so, we've actually helped our population, which is why I'm saying that those 8 million euros are not a cost, but an actual investment. And we are very happy of our decision to invest these amounts and to have worked towards implementing this measure for the whole of the tenure, and I hope in the future too. Thank you very much for these very practical examples that open some perspectives and prove that Andorra could actually offer solutions to other countries. We have a few minutes to open a debate. If any one of you would like to ask the Prime Minister a question or just to comment on what has been said, just please raise your hand. You will have a microphone going through the room, going around the room. Yes. You have the floor, and then behind you. Good morning, and thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I was wondering to what extent you thought that public debt could be used as a leverage, but also could be an obstacle to public policies for the environment, and I'm thinking of all the debates happening at the moment at the European level for the public debt with different visions amongst actors. This is actually a very relevant question, and maybe I forgot to say so, but if we are able to implement what we are implementing at the moment, to fight climate change, it comes at a cost. Even if we are investing in the future, we have a very healthy financial situation. Our indebtedness level is 35% of our general GDP, which is very low if compared with other European countries, which gives us way for ambition to implement such measures, which is why more flexibility is needed when it comes to public debt. When debt means that we're able to implement actions that aim to protect our planet. Let me circle back to what we heard this morning. I think that international institutions and richest countries should work towards helping countries, heavily indebted countries, to help them find solutions to mitigate climate change. I could see someone raising their hand at the bottom of the room. I'm sorry, my French is not very good.
English is good? Thank God. Okay. Thank you so much, Prime Minister. My name is Zahir. I'm from Bangladesh. So my question is, right now, a lot of the developing countries have disagreements, right? Say with a lot of Western countries. We have COP coming up, but there are problems with the loss and damage fund. where we require loss and damage funds, but there are disagreements. But my question is, how do you think we should be overcoming these disagreements? Do you think that maybe the West needs to be bolder in accepting some of these reforms, or there's point for...
Speak a little louder, please.
Sorry, yeah. So for example, there are disagreements between the developing countries and the developed countries, like with the loss and damage fund, where a lot of us need the loss and damage fund, but we have disagreements. So in this case, how do we actually move past that? Is there like a lot more negotiation because so far that has been difficult, or do we need to be even bolder in accepting some compromises?
I think that you're right in what you're saying, and I think that if we want to go faster and go better, obviously we have to work on multilateralism and cooperation between states. And the only forums where we can do that is here, for example, in the Peace Forum, but also in the United Nations, in COP. That's where we have to work together, and we have to embrace together to find common solutions. And obviously, I think that rich countries, like European countries like Andorra, we have to be much more generous. We have to have the capacity to put in the mind of developing countries and understand why you are in this situation. And that's why also in Andorra, we've increased a lot our cooperation, our economical cooperation with developing countries in order to help them to go ahead with climate change, to fight against climate change.
Merci. Une autre intervention?
Thank you. Would anyone else like to take the floor? Any question, any comments? Well, Prime Minister, thank you. I think that your presentation was very enriching. It showed how a country like Andorra, that is under a lot of strain, can still contribute to global endeavors. It is doing so for itself, for Andorra, because its future is in jeopardy at the moment, but also by finding ways for other countries to work on these issues, on public transportation, in this transition in the energy mix. And I think that through innovation and by observing other countries' best practices, we will find a way. It often stems from countries starting initiatives without consulting with other countries that can then be used by other countries. And I think that through communication, by working on best practices, the right models will be able to work towards a better world, to save our planet and your wonderful country. Thank you, Prime Minister. Well, thank you.